Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of Terpenes and Testing, the podcast. This broadcast is brought to you by Mace Media Group and Terpenes and Testing magazine, of course, the industry's first publication dedicated to cannabis science. I'm Jason Lupoi. I'm the editor-in-chief of Terpenes and Testing magazine, and I'll be your host as we navigate across the landscape of cannabis and psychedelics science. We've been publishing a lot of content on how cannabis and psychedelics like magic mushrooms or DMT can quickly help people suffering from mental health conditions, chronic pain, inflammation, or to just break out of the mold and recognize a new happy existence. I think in our modern world, this is sorely needed. So for our sixth guest, I wanted to chat with Dr. Michelle Ross because Dr. Ross is a neuroscientist with fibromyalgia who helps women heal chronic pain naturally with cannabis, mushrooms, kratom, and other botanicals. She has authored 5 books, including Kratom is Medicine, Vitamin Weed, and CBD Oil for Health. As the creator of numerous online courses, including the first certification on cannabis and motherhood, she has educated thousands of patients, clinicians, and cannabis industry professionals around the world on plant medicine. Dr. Ross is a serial entrepreneur and the CEO of Infused Partners, a cannabis consulting firm and business incubator. She has served on the medical advisory boards of many companies in the cannabis and wellness space and holds a PhD in neuroscience, as well as an executive MBA. Dr. Ross is known for breaking boundaries, as she is the first scientist in the world to star on a reality television series, finishing in 4th place on the hit CBS series Big Brother 11. She has been featured on The Today Show, The Doctors, Vice, and many other media outlets, and now lives in Las Vegas. Dr. Ross, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to dive right in here, and your background is quite diverse, and so my thoughts on how we could proceed is also pretty diverse. But just to kind of go back into your bio a little bit, so you're suffering from fibromyalgia. I was curious how plant-based medicine has helped you personally.
Yeah, it's interesting. As a neuroscientist, when I was doing my doctorate and everything, I was pretty healthy. I didn't actually get fibromyalgia until a medical incident where I had blood clots in my lungs. I was exposed to lead in my apartment in Los Angeles, and I just got sicker and sicker. And somehow the medical emergencies that I went through sort of triggered fibromyalgia. And here I was, I had studied cannabis. I'd even helped other people use cannabis for their medical conditions. And it was finally at a point where I was like, well, I don't really use cannabis too much myself, but clearly I need it because I'm taking all these other medications. They're not working. I took drugs like Lyrica, antidepressants, opioids. I was on morphine at one point. All these drugs were just terrible. And really, I ended up using cannabis oil, Rick Simpson oil, and a lot of edibles and other tinctures and things like that. And I was able to replace all these other drugs that had been prescribed by the doctors. And that was sort of how I was able to wean off of all these like 10 different prescriptions I was prescribed at one time. But nowadays it's interesting because, when you're very sick, it takes a lot of medicine to get you healthy. But on a daily basis for me, for fibromyalgia, I use CBD during the day with a little bit of like a 1-to-1 CBD to THC like vape. Because THC, it's funny, even like 10 years later, I still have a very low tolerance to THC. So I tend to use more blends of CBD and THC ratio products to sort of get me through with the pain and spasms without making me too sleepy. But I do take full THC products, usually edibles, before I go to bed. So they help keep me asleep, because definitely sleep is a problem for fibromyalgia patients, as well as pain. So like painsomnia is basically a version of chronic pain that causes insomnia. So I use cannabis in different ways, daytime, nighttime, but for me, I'm not on any other medication. I do use other plant medicines, including kratom sometimes for very severe pain days, and sometimes, medicinal mushrooms and other botanicals. But for me, it's been amazing to go from completely incapacitated in a wheelchair to living my best life with fibromyalgia with plant medicine.
Wow, I mean that's a really compelling story, and I definitely want to talk more about kratom and psilocybin mushrooms. But I was curious. I think a lot of times, and you've been able to get rid of all these other drugs meant to help but really that also hurt. You've been able to do that through just cannabis. And one of the things that I noticed about your background was that you have this course for people like cannabis, basically cannabis and motherhood. And it seems like a lot of what I've read in scientific literature all regards why it shouldn't be used during pregnancy or nursing. But you've developed an education course about this, and I was curious what your thoughts are on where some of these studies have been perhaps misinformed, and what advice that you would offer to somebody that's pregnant that was curious about using cannabis.
Sure. So a lot of my work comes from the fact that as a neuroscientist, I actually studied the development or birth of new brain cells in the brain, a process called neurogenesis. So I already had firsthand experience in this field before I ever entered the cannabis industry. And what I saw as the founder of a nonprofit called Impact Network, which was focused on clinical research and education about cannabis and women's health, was really that women were sort of in the dark about cannabis. Is CBD safe to take during pregnancy? Is it safe to take while breastfeeding? Can you use cannabis as a pain management method during labor instead of opioids or other treatments? And a lot of women had these questions, and they couldn't ask their doctors because Child Protective Services would be called in immediately, even though these states had medical or adult use marijuana programs. And there were thousands, if not millions, of women that had used cannabis discreetly. And so what I realized was there was no information on this topic, and I really needed to gather the papers, gather the anecdotal evidence, do some research myself on this. And what I found was that there was a lot of stigma and misinformation around this topic, similar to other topics concerning brain health and cannabis. So, for example, the misinformation that you see where, you might see studies that suggest that anyone that smokes cannabis might become horribly addicted or that they have brain damage. We see these studies that they're almost more propaganda and poorly done, or almost opinion papers rather than actual real hard science. And we saw the same thing with cannabis and pregnancy and some of the other cannabis and motherhood studies. There was a lot of work done in the past where they would get a poly drug user, for example. So somebody who might have been using methamphetamine, alcohol, smoking cigarettes, and they also used marijuana, right? In this case. And I say marijuana because when they say in the studies, they always call it marijuana, not cannabis, because they're trying to demonize the substance as an illicit substance of abuse. Even in medical states. But these studies were always lumping in all this other drug use with cannabis. And then they would come to the conclusion that cannabis users have babies that, might have slow brain development or, low birth weight and these other issues. But when they found out, when they took all the poly drug use out and the smoking and the alcohol, and they just compared cannabis use to non-cannabis users, there really wasn't that much of a difference. A lot of this, there's other issues that come into why a mother might have a child that is low birth weight or has other like developmental issues. And a lot of these things are based in stigma. And these are things that we cover in my course. For example, Black women are more likely to have a low birth weight baby, right? Different groups, if you have diabetes, you might have a baby with low birth weight. Like there's all these other conditions that cause the same things that maybe you consuming a slight amount of cannabis during pregnancy might cause. But it's not necessarily a life-threatening condition. We know that if a mother abuses alcohol during pregnancy, their child can have fetal alcohol syndrome. There's no fetal cannabis syndrome. There's no fetal marijuana syndrome. We know that cannabis doesn't cause brain damage. We also know that, or we not know, but we really should be compassionate towards mothers, because not all mothers that go through pregnancy, one, not all pregnancies are planned, but two, not all moms are healthy moms. For example, I've never had a kid myself. Unfortunately, I can't have children, but if I had fibromyalgia and I had to have, got pregnant, what would I do for pain management? I have level 8 to 10 pain, every day. What would I do? Should I take opioids? That's not good for the baby. When you look at a mom, they have to make these choices about, risks and benefits and like what's the best thing for them. And for some mothers that were on Oxycontin, before they became pregnant, cannabis is actually a safer option for them. So I would never tell a mom that has never used cannabis before, really, and has no reason to, is having a healthy pregnancy, not in pain, no issues or anything, to start like, smoking joints every day or something. That's of course not healthy. But there are mothers that also have issues with severe nausea and vomiting, and their life is threatened, and the life of their baby is threatened. And for those mothers, consuming cannabis can actually stop that nausea and vomiting. So there's a lot of reasons why mom might use these substances. And we know now that it doesn't have catastrophic consequences. It's like, again, there are consequences to taking opioids, to taking, Xanax, to taking other substances during pregnancy. And we should stop demonizing this and demonizing mothers that use cannabis. So I stress to moms that are using or thinking about using cannabis, one, we need to approach this from a harm reduction standpoint. Let's get you using the lowest amount of cannabis products that is required for your symptoms, during pregnancy, so you don't, expose the fetus to more substances than it needs to. And definitely don't smoke if you don't have to, because again, inhalation of smoke can be very harmful to your baby, just like tobacco smoke is. But there are mindful ways to use cannabis, and we have to remember, again, millions of mothers out there, they're more than just baby carriers. They're people with symptoms, with problems, and if cannabis is going to help them keep down their meal, or it's going to help them with pain, or it's going to help them be less stressed out, so that their baby is healthier, we know that the outcomes are not very, they're not grossly negative. Again, lower birth weight by itself is not something to necessarily cause poor outcomes for the rest of their life. So, I would love if we lived in a perfect world where no mom needed any medication, but that's not the reality. So my goal is really to just provide education around what the harms are, what you can do to offset some of those harms, whether there's certain vitamins to take or certain methods that maybe you shouldn't try or not. But that's really been my goal. And it's been weird. It's been like controversial and everything. And a lot of research has come out over the years and now that disputes some of the old research. So it's exciting that what I was thinking and seeing with my patients and my clients, 4 or 5 years ago, is now being confirmed with research studies. So I don't feel like such a bad guy. Like, it's sometimes hard when you're like, hey, moms, pregnant moms, it's okay if you use cannabis. Like, you're definitely
Right.
the bad guy. I had a lot of professors from other countries, Canada, et cetera, like send me warning letters, like,
Wow.
you can't do this, like it's you're a disgrace and things like that. And I mean, it's no different from the neuroscientists that were studying cannabis back in the day, doing MRIs and showing like, hey, it doesn't cause brain damage. And they're getting a lot of flack from the community. But, we were trained as neuroscientists and scientists, right? Cannabis is bad. Cannabis is a drug. We shouldn't be telling people to take cannabis. And then the research, of course, now is easing up and actually looking at the data rather than making propaganda papers. So it's a weird time, but it's like I've always been on the forefront of saying things that like made people very uncomfortable. And it's now I have actually the support of a lot of mothers in the community. Like, there's a group of mothers, that they call themselves things like Canna moms and things like that. But there are women that have had, 3 or 4 children, while consuming cannabis, and they're all healthy. Their kids are like valedictorians. They're just like all the things that you read on the news. You would think that because I puffed, once on a cannabis joint, so I wouldn't throw up on my brains and could actually keep down food for my baby, you would think that my kid was, in the special class for the rest of their life. And that's not the truth, and I know that personally. I know when I went to graduate school, I had friends whose moms consumed cannabis while they were pregnant with them, and they were neuroscience PhDs. So clearly it was like from the get-go, before I even started really with working the cannabis industry, I knew for a fact that the things that I wasn't reading wasn't true. And it's really helped me be, again, you're supposed to be skeptical as a scientist, right? But it's really it's sort of crazy when the mainstream media just keep covering cannabis is bad,
Right.
and also targeting the women that need it the most. Women need support. It's not easy being pregnant. It's not easy being a mom and being told like, sorry, take your opioids, don't take that CBD tincture. You're going to murder your baby. Like there's such misinformation out there and such harm to those mothers. And it's still just terrible, the stigma that they go through. So I just try to do as much education as I can, to help support them, but also again, being firm on, what are the lines that are appropriate. Can you dab while breastfeeding? Like that's not okay behavior, right? It's like, what's the harmful behavior? What's the correction that could lead them to more mindful use if they are using inappropriately.
Yeah, and I think that misinformation piece, that's definitely in the the scientific literature for sure, because I've said this before. If you just go to Google Scholar and type in the word cannabis, usually the first 10 pages or so that you can scroll through are a lot of cannabis use dependency articles, and you have to really search for ones that might be more of the therapeutic aspects, unless you know what you're looking for. If you just type in cannabis, that's what you get. We actually did a blog, I think it was called, I think we called it Cannabis Meets the Twilight Zone, because it was a blog about how a nicotine patch could get you off of daily use of cannabis. And I remember reading that and saying, like, isn't that what you're supposed to do with medicine? Like, you usually use this on a daily basis, and we're going to turn back to nicotine, to get us off of cannabis. So I thought that was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I am in a lot of contact with researchers who haven't either published their work because it's been so controversial, maybe not publishable, basically the morality around these things. But for example, one of the issues that we've had with the opioid epidemic, is that even women using legal prescription drugs, right? They'll take their oxycodone, be pregnant, and then their baby will be in opioid withdrawal, shaking and having, all those issues, and it's very dangerous. And how they treat newborns that are opioid addicted in the hospitals is that they actually give them a little bit of morphine and then like taper them down. Now, as a neuroscientist in my work, as a graduate student, we know that opioids actually slow down new brain cell growth. And the brain is rapidly growing during pregnancy and also that postpartum period. It's growing all the way through the age of 25 in reality. But like giving opioids, after birth is damaging to their brain. It's going to slow down their brain. So the issue is not so much that the opioids cause the brain damage issues. It's like even the treatment of opioid withdrawal is damaging. And so one researcher was actually talking with me a couple of years ago about how they're going to use CBD instead to basically treat the opioid withdrawal, because we know that CBD is helpful for morphine withdrawal and other opioid withdrawal. There's a lot of work in Mount Sinai about some of those topics. And the same thing could be used for babies, right? So if babies are showing opioid withdrawal, is it safer to give them morphine, or could you give them the CBD oil instead? We know that there are babies and very, very young children that are given CBD oil for seizures. So it's safe. And I think, from my clinical point of view, that using CBD oil to treat neonatal opioid withdrawal would be a great way, to treat that rather than giving them more morphine or more opioids. So I think that there's a lot of things that are happening right now. It's like 10 years from now, we're going to feel silly. We're like, oh yeah, CBD oil was totally safe for moms, and maybe even a little THC. But right now, I mean, we're still at the tipping point where, if you ask your doctor based on what they've seen, they think it's terrible. But I think things will change.
Yeah, I think to tie into my next question, that sort of current stance by the medical community, I wanted to talk a little bit about kratom, because I think that often you see kratom for sale in head shops or places that might not seem super medicinal, like tobacco stores, whatever. And I think that might give people the wrong impression of its medical merit, just like CBD kind of it became in every storefront imaginable. I heard that here in Pittsburgh there was a store, like a gun store, that had like an assault rifle on one side of the sign, and I think the other side said now selling CBD or something, which I thought was a pretty interesting dichotomy. But how have you seen kratom help people? And you said you use kratom yourself. What's the reality behind kratom, and how have you seen it help people? And are there any adverse effects that you'd seen?
Sure. So when I first used kratom, it was actually while I was struggling with some of the side effects of cannabis use. So this was about like 2016. So I was using cannabis, but I was still like very sleepy during the day. So it was really hard for me to find a good balance between pain relief and fatigue. So fibromyalgia also causes fatigue. So it's like sleep issues, fatigue, pain. So if you take cannabis, like I just wanted to sleep all day. And then if I wasn't like heavily medicated, I was just in horrible pain and then wanted to sleep. So like I was a mess. And so I realized that I needed to find something else to basically provide energy and pain relief. And for me, it's just funny. Sativa, like cannabis products, they help a lot of people with, and I hate that term again, but it's like, again, your audience might be more familiar with, cannabis blends that have terpenes that are more stimulating than sedative. But I just couldn't take them the way they would flare up my pain. So there's certain terpenes that I'm very sensitive to. It's weird. But so for me, I ended up, asking like, what else do people use that's like natural? I'm not an herbalist or anything. And so somebody sent me a package of kratom. I tried it out. And what I found was that it helped me focus. It gave me energy. And I wasn't really using it so much for the pain control, but what I found was when I took small amounts of kratom and small amounts of cannabis or small amounts of CBD, even that's actually what I use during the day is CBD, small amounts of CBD, small amounts of kratom, it kept me awake, focused. And I like literally felt like my old self before my diseases. And that was just such a beautiful thing. And I was like, but I don't even know what's in it. It looks like very much a powder. I'm a scientist. Like, I don't understand what this is. I can't find any information on it. And I was really frustrated because I felt like I was doing something wrong. Felt like I was using like some weird drug, like, because that's how it was sort of marketed. It was very like
Right.
dirty. It was like, oh, this is incense. Shh, don't tell anyone, write incense on the memos. And it was like, it was so weird and sketchy. And yeah, there was no testing. You didn't know how much of the active ingredients were. And of course, that now there's an American Kratom Association that passed all these different laws in different states, including Nevada, where I live, where they require supplement, labeling and how much percentage of metrogenin and 7-OH metrogenin, which is the active ingredients. Just like cannabis products have like a percent THC and a percent CBD on the back. Like it's really important that it doesn't have E. coli or heavy metals or things like that. So certain states require testing and things like that. Certain don't. It's not really standardized because it's sort of not really legal in the United States. It's not a supplement. It's not an approved drug. It's like somewhere in between right now because the FDA is like a mess. And they just don't want it legal at all in the United States. But anyways, this is what this powder does. It activates opioid receptors and other receptors too in the body. Like it's similar to CBD where it has like so many different activities. This kratom powder has, I would say, there's almost like an entourage effect in kratom. So you have all these different alkaloids in there. They're doing different things at different receptors, from serotonin receptors, dopamine receptors, opioid receptors. But the main difference between kratom and an opioid or an opiate, it's not an opiate. It has opioid-like activities. It's not an opiate. Technically, the definition of opiate is something that's derived from the opium poppy, so it's something like morphine, right? But opiates can cause death. That's the whole opioid epidemic. Basically, you take too much opioids, it shuts down your breathing via the opioid receptors and your brainstem, and basically, you die in your sleep. With kratom, there isn't that. So basically it will activate these opioid receptors, but it doesn't in a certain way where it doesn't activate the downstream pathways that cause respiratory depression. So you can take a lot of this product, and as long as you're not taking, say, other opioids, like you're not taking some oxycodone or tramadol with it, you're not drinking alcohol or taking Xanax or something all at the same time, this is a safe substance. There have been some people that have died with kratom in their system, and that's, you know, why there's this whole FDA thing where they wanted to ban kratom use across the United States. But each and every case was a polydrug case where somebody, again, it's like, we know that you shouldn't be using antidepressants and drinking like till you're blackout drunk. Like it was basically, all these cases were like sort of like the Heath Ledger type of cases where they were just doing 7 different things at once, and that's not safe. And it wasn't necessarily the kratom that killed them, it was everything, you know.
Right.
So for me as a consumer, and as somebody who actually consults people on kratom, the biggest thing is always when someone's new, they go, I don't want to become addicted, opioids are unsafe and things like that. I use 2 to 3 capsules of kratom in the morning. If I'm in pain again, you know, I might take some later because it's a short acting pain reliever. You know, it only works for about 4 to 5 hours at most. So it's not like an extended release. So just like almost any supplement, if you're using it for inflammation or pain, you got to take it a couple times a day. But I'm not taking like 15 pills at a time. Like I'm taking like, okay, like a 2 grams of a substance that isn't super pharmaceutical strength. So the people that tend to have issues with kratom dependence are people that have switched over from basically they're in recovery from opioids. So there are a lot of people that come to kratom that were previously heroin addicts, for example, or Oxycontin addicts, right? And so this is harm reduction, is to basically swap out, you know, heroin for Suboxone, right? Or methadone. And we do that in the pharmaceutical world. But here, when we're talking about people swapping out opioids for kratom, it's looked down upon by the medical industry because it's not those prescription drugs. But taking high amounts of kratom, for example, 15 grams, 20, 25 grams versus like what I'm taking, like 1 to 2 grams at a time, can lead to dependence, you know, withdrawal symptoms like irritability or even like pain, stomach issues. Like there are issues with taking a lot. So we tend to not see that with the average user. And my book actually goes over, you know, a lot of the myths about kratom use. For example, you might think because, you know, again, that image of kratom users are all just like opioid addicts or things like that, because you're seeing it like sold in weird, sketchy head shops and things like that. The reason why it's sold there is because kratom merchant processing is actually worse than cannabis and CBD merchant processing. It's like really hard. So people that have already been approved for nicotine and stuff can sell kratom, whereas a regular CBD store might not actually be able to. And I've seen that challenge over the years. But the perception of who is the kratom user is so off. It's almost like how bad it was with cannabis users back in the day, right? Like who's a stoner? Like who are these people? And you're like, actually like CEOs and like normal people, right? Where cannabis users are just normal people. Well, very similarly, the kratom user tends to be somebody who has chronic pain. So, you know, who has chronic pain in the United States? You know,
Right.
people with back pain, women. It's actually, there's a predominantly, at least in surveys, women are users of kratom, but they're not telling their friends. There's not on video, like talking about their kratom use. It's sort of like everyone's like little quiet secret, like that they're taking kratom capsules or taking kratom peat for their pain instead of opioids. And, you know, I'm hoping that, you know, people will be more visible about it, but because it's in this weird unregulated space, there's still so much stigma about it. So the average kratom user is using kratom responsibly for their chronic pain. And why did they choose kratom? Well, they might have actually not had good health insurance and might be trying to manage their pain by themselves. And somebody told them about it and they're using that in addition to an ad set or something like that. Or some of them actually had opioids, a legit opioid prescription, and their doctor cut them off because in the opioid epidemic, a lot of doctors were told, you know, new rules about prescriptions, and they were like, "Oh, you're not supposed to prescribe opioids for pain management for like a back injury, like for more than a couple days." So all of a sudden, you know, when they issued those guidelines, a whole bunch of people got cut off. And they're like, but I still have pain. What do I do? And so a lot of those patients moved to kratom eventually when they found that out. So right now it's like kratom is a big secret. It's misunderstood. Most of the work I do is like trying to convince people that they're not going to die. They're not going to end up in rehab. You know, it's going to be okay. It's not the gateway drug to, you know, like meth or something like that. Like so many people have these misconceptions, and it literally is like how cannabis was 10 to 15 years. If I smoke that joint, I'm going to be a junkie. You're like, I literally make a little tea. Like I make a actual, I call this aura tea because my company is Aura Therapeutics, but like I make a tea with this green kratom powder that's like bitter matcha powder. I put some cocoa in it and like some red raspberry powder and drink it when I'm having a severe fibromyalgia flare. I'm not a junkie. You know, and I try to talk about kratom as medicine as much as possible, but as you can see, if there's a lot of stigma around this and governments are trying to like shut this down, I've had my Instagrams taken down. I literally will just post a picture of me like holding a book. I get stuff taken down. Like I can't communicate about it. It's really hard. And then even just having a book called Kratom is Medicine. I've had also people send me emails too, like, oh, my kid died because of you. And I was like, no, like
Wow.
there's no kids dying of kratom. Like this is not, because I work with the legislators, like all these stories that they're like, people just post these things that aren't true everywhere. And it's like the same kind of hatred we had towards cannabis use back in the day. Oh, all these babies died because of cannabis. It's like, they didn't. So, you know, trying to fight stigma with science, I think is the most important thing. And really, you know, being able to deliver information to the community is getting harder and harder because Facebook and Instagram and social media is really banning words like, you know, CBD, kratom, things like that. They're banning accounts. So I'm actually been developing like a platform for our community for people to access that information, for doctors to be trained on what kratom is, just like there's continuing education for cannabis. Right now, a doctor has no clue what kratom is. They're going to tell you not to touch it. They have no idea. It sounds really scary and sketchy. Like they think it's like, basically they think it's like a new drug that people are snorting or something. Like, so most of them will not understand that it's actually maybe a safer choice than the Oxycontin they're prescribing. So there's a lot of stigma to go over, but the fact that in 2022, there are many, many safe companies in a GMP approved facilities doing everything right, doing the lab testing. You know, I've toured these facilities. There's a lot of really, really good people out there making high quality product, the same as you see in the cannabis industry. And I think that for a patient, there should be no confusion if they're using, again, a quality product, you know, about the safety of this. I really think that kratom is the CBD of opioids. And I really hope that somebody who's struggling with pain or struggling with fatigue, and again, like 90% of the fibromyalgia patients that I've worked with have responded really well to kratom. Some of them have had the side effects where they're like, oh, it hurts my tummy. I was like, use capsules instead of the tea, right? But it's just like with cannabis. Most people respond well to cannabis. It's about finding the right product, the right dosing. So I think that for certain conditions, specifically the ones that have a lot of pain and fatigue, like multiple sclerosis, for example, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, those all respond really, really well to kratom. And so I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg about understanding what this plant, who's a relative of the coffee fam, it's actually a member of the coffee plant. I'm saying it wrong, but the coffee family. It is a demonized plant that's actually safe, that is actually contains antioxidants, that may have anti-cancer properties. Like, I'm excited by kratom because I really think it's like the new cannabis. There's an entourage effect in kratom. There's just so many things that we just don't know about it because there's not enough people researching it. I would say there's maybe like 5 kratom researchers in the United States right now. Most of them are studying it actually as a tool to help with opioid addiction. And I think one lab is also studying it as a potential use for methamphetamine addiction. But again, it's like, that's the same when we see CBD being researched, or like use CBD to get people off of opioids. I was like, there's other ways to use these medicines besides just in the addiction field. But because our government is set up, the way NIDA is set up for funding, that they can only fund addiction studies, they can't fund these other studies. So until then, it's basically like citizen science research, you know, collecting what we have, the work I do with clients and things like that. But you basically have to like make your own pharmaceutical company to be able to study this. And it's just really, really difficult. So I just do think that kratom plus CBD plus all these other plant medicines, I think that using all these tools, somebody can make the choice to go completely on plant medicine if they want to.
That's really excellent insight. I know someone whose doctor basically told them to get a new doctor when they tried to bring up how kratom was helping them. So I definitely appreciate your insights. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I really wanted to talk to you about psychedelics, so we will definitely have to get you back on the podcast here and dive into some of your work in the uh, decriminalization efforts in Denver and moving forward from that too. So I want to thank you for taking some time out of your schedule to be our guest today and for chatting with us on how cannabis and kratom can help humankind in profound ways.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. If anyone ever has any questions, you can find me at drmichelleross.com or on Instagram at drmichelleross. I'm always happy to answer questions.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. We will see you next time on Terpenes and Testing, the podcast. Until then, please come visit us at www.terpenesandtesting.com or on one of our social media platforms. Cheers.